I'm Jerry Seib with the Wall Street Journal. Today we're joined by former Senator Chris Dodd, author of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Did I get that right?
You got it all right in, that's it.
And we're talking 5 years after the real financial crisis
Right.
hit September 5 years ago. And I'm wondering, as you look back on that and having traveled the road to get to the Dodd-Frank Reform Act, do you think we've done a lot? Have we done enough to make the system safer?
We've done a lot, and I hope by the end of this year, at least what I've heard from Jack Lew and others, they really want to get these rules done. The Boca rules.
The implementation of your act.
Get done. And then, of course, you're going to have to test it. I mean, like anything else, Jerry, I mean, we did the best we could, but you're sailing in the dark to a large extent. When we wrote the too big to fail provisions in the bill, the Dodd-Frank legislation, I think we got it right, and there are more and more indications we may have. But the ultimate test will be when you're called upon to really make it work. So I'm sure there are unintended consequences. This wasn't Talmudic. This was not biblical when we wrote this. I had to get 60 votes in the Senate of the United States, a supermajority, to pass the bill. And so you're cobbling together elements. It's not everything I would have written had I been king for a day at all. Your colleagues are co-equal partners in all of this because every vote can make a difference in the passage of the legislation. But I think it'll stand the test of time. I think one of the indications, people talk about repealing Obamacare, but no one's talking about repealing this legislation. They may want tweaks to it, changes to it, which I may totally support, by the way, in time. But I think overall, we've made a difference. We're not going to go back to the environment. In fact, much of what we did in the fall of 2008, today under the Dodd-Frank legislation, is illegal.
So, for example?
Well, for instance, you can't have the writing that using taxpayer money out of the Federal Reserve System. You couldn't do that today. It's against the law, in a sense. So the idea that funeral plans, where actually these institutions are going to have to pay for their unwinding process, you get an orderly process. The FDIC will do it. There are legitimate questions about that, but I think the FDIC can do this in time.
Well, do you think this core problem that you mentioned at the outset, the too big to fail, has that really been solved?
We think so, but again, it'll take a test in time. There are a couple of things that, again, when you're looking back at a perfect world, what I wanted to add, I think bankruptcy laws probably need to be examined a little more closely as to whether or not we have the capacity to unwind under our current structure of the bankruptcy laws. And I worry about that a little bit. But aside from that, I think the idea of having the funeral plans in advance, I think will help tremendously, that the burden does fall on not only the institutions that are being unraveled, but also other institutions would have to pay the cost of that. I think is going to build in a discipline into this that minimizes these kinds of things occurring in the future as well. Raising the capital standards, raising leverage. The oversight, the Financial Services Oversight Board, it seems like such a simple idea, and you wonder why it wasn't done, rather than legislating it be required to be done, where you actually have these agencies talking to each other on a regular basis, identifying products and institutions that pose systemic risk. Simple things like that, getting real-time data in the Department of Treasury independently so that you're collecting information. I'll go to my grave believing that had in 2007, even earlier in 2008, we would have had a crisis, but a far less significant one, because we waited so long to recognize the depth of this problem and the implications of it.
Do you worry that we still have regulators tripping over each other, doing the same things, or one on top of the other?
You may recall in 2009, I proposed what I called a discussion draft bill. In that discussion draft bill, I created one prudential regulator. And in fact, I was right.
That wasn't a wildly popular idea, as I recall. Every regulator was mad at you.
I can't tell you the number of people who probably said, but we should have listened to you more carefully. It made a lot more sense. And I would have put consumer protection and prudential regulation sort of in the same house where they would have complemented each other a bit. Now that's, again, I wasn't king for the day, and you were right. I had a very negative response to the idea of cleaning out what has involved, this regulatory arbitrage over the years, AIG being the classic example of that. Right. So we got rid of the OTS and others, but I would have done more than that. I think that more consolidation could still occur. If
you were king for a day today, now, is there one thing you would have done differently in drafting the legislation or pushing it through?
Well, I would have liked to have had that. I think that would have been a major reform. Fannie and Freddie. I mean, I'm a great advocate of housing finance. I think having the government play a role. I think the 30-year fixed rate mortgage has been a great wealth creator, taking people from poverty into the middle class, and we shouldn't underestimate that. We made that, obviously, the residential mortgage crisis was where this all was born. So obviously, opening up the floodgates to anybody showing up without doing the due diligence to determine who could qualify is a problem. But you need a new Fannie, you need a new housing financing
Yeah.
structure. It wasn't for lack of trying. Judge Gregg had it right one day on the floor of the Senate when asked the question. He said, "We tried, we just couldn't come up with an answer for it." But I regret that. I think
Then that
would've
was
made
just
the
a
piece.
bridge too far,
Bit too far,
given
and
everything
just
else that
no
was
one knew what
going
they
on.
wanted to do. In fact, Hank Paulson made the recommendation of creating sort of what he called a public utility model, which I've always liked that idea.
The housing finance public utility model.
Yeah, this way, because you had that conflict between your investors and the mission. And that's where a lot of this, where you had that clash, where you're trying to satisfy your investors' needs and their obligations to them as investors, and then completing the mission of providing housing for those who couldn't afford it.
And it doesn't appear that since you left the Senate, anybody else has figured out the Fannie Freddie solution.
Not yet, although Mark Warner and Bob Corker are getting close to something that I think has a lot of merit and that looks as though it's got some chance of building some broad bipartisan support. So I watch that now as I'm sitting in the bleachers. I watch this now, Jerry.
You know, there's the regulatory structure and there are processes, but there's also attitudes. I wonder if you think Wall Street has learned its lesson. You know, you can regulate activity, but you can't necessarily regulate mindset. How do you think we've come on that path?
Not far enough, I must say. You know, I get asked the question a lot. Well, tell me what you were trying to do with this bill. And obviously they're too big to fail, and oversight, transparency, consumer protection. But the one word I constantly kept in my mind through all of this was the word confidence. It had been shattered by this process, and restoring it was critical. You can't quantify it, I can't legislate it. You just hope that by creating or doing certain things, you restore that. Consumer confidence, investor confidence. I still think we haven't closed that gap, despite all the other things we've done. And a lot of that comes, in my view, from the community itself. The recognition that we did get off track here. Whether or not, I'm not asking you to agree with every provision I wrote in the bill. That'd be silly. I realize you disagree with a lot of that. But to understand what happened, I'll never forget years ago, a manager of Sovereign Wealth Fund, I asked him, I said, why do you park so much of your money in the United States? And he said, well, for two reasons, very simply. He said, one, you Americans are pretty good at making money. He said, but secondly, and more importantly than the first reason, I've never lost a wink of sleep worrying about the architecture of your financial services sector. He said, I've made bad bets, I've lost money, but never because the architecture was wrong.
Yeah.
And it is now.
Yeah.
And getting the architecture right.
At that point, he thought it was wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And so getting this, rebuilding a 21st century architecture of financial services was what was on my mind, obviously. But restoring confidence was really the purpose, ultimate vision. What are you trying to do?
Well, do you think that confidence factor is one of the reasons that having gotten through the worst of the crisis and having changed the system, we're still seeing an unsatisfactory economy? You know, unemployment is not really has not really been resolved. Right. The housing sector is not really fully back. Is that a confidence issue?
I believe it is. I think it's a question where you'll get moments when people seem to feel a little bit and then they pull back again as well. And I think that lack of that sense of security, that things are going to be okay, that the structures are good again, I think is a major factor. It's not the only one, but I think it's a major factor, and that we really haven't taken off in ways that we should.
Let me ask you this final question, just as an observer. One of the big players in any scenario like the one you lived through in 2008 and afterwards is the Federal Reserve.
Right.
How would you rate its performance? Are there things it should be thinking about doing differently as time goes forward?
Well, I think history will give Ben Bernanke a tremendous amount of credit, in my view. I think he was slow to start, candidly. I think in 2006, 2007, when I became chairman of the committee, we did 90 hearings that year. And I again, believe very strongly that had I gotten more of a response from the administration and the Fed in 2007, we could have stopped this metastasizing this problem. But Ben Bernanke, in my view, will go down in history as a great leader during one of the most serious economic crises in the history of the country. So I have a high degree of respect and regard for him in many, many ways. And so I say that. Now, I honestly believe as well that we ought to be looking at architecturally the Federal Reserve System. I have serious questions about the validity and need of regional banks, the way they're presently structured, the supervisory function. While it's getting better, and we certainly included it in the bill,
right.
I'd like to see more participation. Historically, there was not a lot. Maybe they're getting better. So the Fed is a critical player. One of the major provisions we're avoiding this bill, and that is requiring the kind of auditing that certain elements we're insisting upon, we maintain the independence of the Fed. And had you destroyed the independence of the Fed, as many wanted to do, I think we would have.
And you think the auditing outcry would have produced a diminution of the independence of the
Well,
Fed?
we provided some auditing, but what they wanted to do, I think, would have clearly been a major destroyer of the Fed's independence.
And that's been preserved in your view?
In my view, we've preserved it.
Chris Dodd, author of the Dodd-Frank Act, the biggest legislative response to the financial crisis. Thanks for joining us to share some thoughts.
Thank you, Jerry.